The government is hoping new fast-track consenting legislation will speed up the building of much-needed infrastructure. To talk about that, I'm joined by Infrastructure New Zealand's Policy Director, Michelle McCormick. So looking at this proposal to bring this fast-track legislation in, are you confident that it's actually going to speed up the process for building infrastructure?
Yes, I think we've seen with the COVID-19 recovery fast-track legislation, it has made a difference to blocking the pipeline and to getting some projects moving a little bit faster through that planning consenting phase than what might have been the situation. I think it's important that the government looks at those lessons. What have we learnt from the few years that we've had that in place, and also from the other mechanisms that they've looked to fast-track the Board of Inquiry process, strict referrals, and what can be learnt out of there. Where are the real sticking points in the consenting process?
One change that seems to be most apparent is that under the government's proposed legislation, ministers are effectively going to decide what goes forward, and once they've decided what goes forward, it's actually pretty much approved. It's just a matter of this panel determining what are the conditions.
Yep.
I mean, I wondered, how worried are you that the process could then be politicised in that way?
It's a lot of responsibility on the minister and going to be a lot of pressure to keep things moving too, because we have previously seen time blowouts at that ministerial decision-making phase when things get a bit complex and a bit hard, and there's been a reluctance to refer things or rubber stamp them, put them through. It's an interesting process, and the expert panel will be looking at the conditions, and they can choose to have a hearing or not have a hearing too, which for transparency purposes certainly maybe brings into question, particularly some of these very complex projects, to make sure that we are, we're very keen for infrastructure to go ahead, but we want to know that there are the safeguards there for the environmental protection and for our communities too. It has to be a win-win.
Where are the biggest priorities? Are there areas of infrastructure that when there's really needed to be unblock what's, stopping that from being built, or?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing it on the water side and the major upgrades and new waste facilities, that sort of reservoirs that we actually need at the moment. Transport is a perennial blockage. We really need some big projects to happen there, and a lot of effort has gone into planning things like the Second Harbour Crossing, looking at big major public transport projects too, and of course in terms of renewable energy too, we have some big projects there, offshore energy generation, even just some of the solar farms that are needed. That's a big area. I think also too, shouldn't be forgotten that a lot of our existing infrastructure will need renewal, and there's consenting issues with some of those in coastal marine areas and that too. So yeah, the new fast-track legislation needs to be able to accommodate and have a good process for all of those.
I mean, just picking up on your reference to water, I mean, the government's also scrapped the previous government's legislation around Three Waters reform, and is now in the process of going to introduce its own legislation this year and the year after. And it's all about giving control back to local councils. Is that going to slow up the building of the sorts of water infrastructure that we need? And do you have confidence the councils will be able to pick up that challenge?
I think it is going to be a huge challenge for them. I guess probably the biggest challenge will be the funding side of things. The planning consenting can be reasonably, straightforward. There's, processes in place for that. But actually, how do you fund these really long-term assets on a fair, equitable basis? And they're going to need to debt fund, and we know councils, some of them are up to their debt limits already. So I think in terms of the water infrastructure challenges, it's not necessarily the planning consenting constraints. It will be financial.
I mean, financial, though, it covers all infrastructure, doesn't it? I mean, because while the consenting can be an issue, I mean, when we look at what the country needs across a range of infrastructure, the cost is pretty mind-boggling, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, what was it, 2018? It was 210 billion, and we're counting. I mean, there's been a huge amount of inflation in that time too. It really is going to draw on the importance of having established pipeline of infrastructure, having those properly costed, because we've seen a lot of initial low cost estimations and then, you know, what appears to be a huge blowout, but actually it's once a project is properly scoped that, you know, the real costs and you know, extra pieces that you need to connect to actually make the network work included in there. So yeah, it's I think funding is not going to go away. Well, we need to look at different funding tools too. We can't always just pay as we go. We you know, these are long-term assets. Some of them, you know, 100 years assets that we do need to have, you know, intergenerational funding for, you know, people in the future who are going to be using them too.
Well, I mean, the government is looking, I guess, and the previous government too was looking at other ways that you could fund infrastructure. I mean, are there things that stand out for you that are options that look better than others?
Yeah, we have a working group who has been looking at this, and I think there's a big difference between, you know, the real mega projects that probably need some Crown backing, and then some, you know, smaller, you know, local council, social community type infrastructure projects too. I think it's being able to make sure that there is revenue being generated. Te Wāhanga Infrastructure Commission put out a really interesting report just in the last few weeks and looking at public's views on terms of funding and paying for infrastructure they use and different attitudes. And I think there's some really, you know, people are starting to recognise that it's not a free lunch, that you do need to pay as you go, and, you know, we have aspirations of having world-class assets and infrastructure that we can use, and we see it overseas when we travel, but we actually need to be paying, you know, tolls and, you know, congestion charges, you know, are a way of life overseas, and I think realistically they need to start, you know, becoming more common here too.
Have we been too slow to look at those other funding models?
I think we have, yeah. There's been a lot of talk, and across the political spectrum there seems to be support there, but is there political bravery to actually take it forward? It will be interesting to see.
Because I suppose if we say, look at PPPs, you know, Transmission Gully gets raised as an example of why you wouldn't do a PPP, or, I mean, but is it a matter of not the model, but how well you set it up to make sure it works for you?
Yeah, definitely. And looking at where that risk is sitting, when, you know, in Transmission Gully, you know, there was a lot of risk with the ground and earthworks, and that was where it came through. And, you know, what we're seeing is the evolution of PPP models overseas. Some of that risk is taken back onto, you know, the party who can best look after it, and then it's done in phases. So the earthworks might be done, and then the PPP applies to the rest of the infrastructure that's developed. And so there's ways of splitting things up and looking at where that risk most appropriately sits too.
Well, I mean, I guess given the limited funding, I mean, how do you prioritise, you know, what comes first? What, you know, how do you decide what is the infrastructure you need first? I mean, and that's without, I suppose, talking about schools and hospitals, that sort of infrastructure.
Yeah, and there's a huge need there. I mean, that is a political decision, and we talked about the pipeline, but ultimately some of the assurance around that in terms of prioritising, you know, there's assessment, there's a prioritised list, but, you know, within that envelope, the government, you know, of the day, who, you know, is often putting a lot of money towards that, will have the say on, you know, what their political priorities are, and that's totally appropriate. And as a community, you know, we get to vote and we get to have a say into those processes too. But I mean, yeah, there's no shortage of want and need.
But isn't there a danger with that approach, so, you know, again, politics, that it's what's popular rather than what's really needed?
Yeah, I think, yeah, we do need to start looking more long term. It's easy to get a short term project done over, you know, something that is going to be multi government periods to actually construct. We're seeing that a lot. But I think as a country, yeah, we need to grow up a little bit and actually agree what is the ultimate priorities.
I mean, so, you know, in that sense, would it be good to get, if you like, bipartisan or multi-party support for sort of some general approach to infrastructure rather than the parties arguing about it each election time?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be really helpful for our industry too, because, you know, with the tap turning on and off, it's not good for, you know, the companies who are gearing up, who are training staff, you know, who are bringing in expertise for overseas, to suddenly have these projects stopped in the tracks, and it's not good actually for New Zealand's reputation to have that happen so frequently.
Michelle McCormick, thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.
For more content just like this and all the latest business and political news, head over to mbr.co.nz.